Hello everyone, this is your instructor Jonathan Dallinger for Communication 350 Intercultural Communication. Coming to you with one more video here, trying to cover some of those topics that we've been looking at the past month. And it's been a while since I did a video recap, so let's talk about some of these concepts as we go into the exam. Just a few general things to discuss before we get into the substantive matters. Well, first of all, the exam is coming up. That is tomorrow from noon until midnight. Um, at that point, I will release a report to you that should show you what questions you got wrong, and the grades will be up shortly thereafter, giving you kind of your point total there, and that should be the final grade item for the semester. The exam is going to follow the same format as last time, so again, multiple choice questions, 50 questions, same period of time, an hour and a half from when you start it, it must be completed. But other than that, it's following pretty much the same kind of format and ideas. It's mostly focusing on concepts in the second half of the class, with a couple of questions carried over from the first half of the class, just for kind of review's sake and to see if that makes life a little easier. You should now be able to see all your discussion post grades on D2L with the exception of the last one, which will be closed as of tomorrow. So if you still haven't earned all of the available discussion points where they cap out at 300, feel free to post on that final discussion board by midnight as well tomorrow, and that can earn you some extra points there. Most people have finished them, the discussion posts, and exceeded that 300 point cap. So that might be a reason if you look at the D2L gradebook and you don't see a grade for a thing, a recent discussion post that you completed, that's because you already exceeded the 300 point cap and I didn't put more points up on the gradebook because that's where it caps out. D2L is not very good at handling that kind of thing, but you get the idea. Another thing you can look for is once the grades are completed, and by that I mean once we've finished the exam and any remaining discussion boards, I will by the end of the week try and post a summary of your final grade that is a breakdown of all the extra credit, all of the discussion points and everything else. So you can see your total points in the class, and then you should be able to, from there, compare that to the syllabus and figure out where you stand in terms of the letter grade. And that should give you a sense as to what's going on before official grades are released. Of course, if you see anything that looks kind of fishy or weird there, let me know, and I'll be happy to double check things or explain them as possible. I'd just like to give you a heads up before final grades are due so that you can kind of get a sense as to where you're going to be before that point. So let's talk about the discussion posts from the recent weeks. First, you were tasked with a pop culture kind of exercise. You were to look at a specific music video. You were allowed to pick from several options and kind of analyze them in terms of stereotypes and uncertainty and how you might be responding to the content in those videos. Now, we could consider this in terms of our research paradigms, and this would probably fall under, this particular exercise would probably fall under the critical paradigm, right? We're thinking about socio-historical factors and power structures and analyzing them accordingly to think about our reactions to these images and portrayals. So the two main ideas here were stereotypes and uncertainty. So we can ask ourselves several questions when we start an analysis or a critique. Because when we're being critical and critically reflective, we're thinking about our own reactions and responses to what we're seeing. So how does this video even make you feel to begin with? Does it make you uncomfortable? Does it make you laugh? Does it make you feel more comfortable in thinking about these kinds of people being represented? Does that reflect maybe a violation of uncertainty for you? So maybe you had certain expectations about that group, and watching one of these videos perhaps increased uncertainty or relieved it. Perhaps you felt like now you know a little bit more about that group and you'd be more equipped to engage with them, perhaps. Is it rejecting or confirming stereotypes in that way? And that's kind of the crux of this issue, is we want to think about, all right, how exactly are these music videos influencing our perceptions of a particular group? Do we like the Childish Gambino video because he's rejecting stereotypes of black men in the United States, or is he fulfilling them in some ways? Devil Makes Three, are these kind of matching up with what you would expect people playing bluegrass music to look like, and do the lyrics reflect those ideas that you would expect to be in bluegrass music? In a lot of ways, these videos all kind of reaffirm some stereotypes in some ways and reject them in others. And that's kind of the idea that we want to engage with here. I think a really important lesson that we got out of this exercise, and a lot of people demonstrated this in their discussion posts, is that people vary at the individual level. And this is a constant tension that we've talked about over the course of the semester, is when are generalizations appropriate and when do they break down? And they tend to break down at the individual level because everyone's different, right? People are idiosyncratic. Now, what's interesting about thinking about this trend in light of the music videos is often you have necessarily an individual standing in for a whole group. And so there is a deliberate message being sent most of the time. They're aware of this. The artists are aware of it, and they're trying to send a certain message accordingly. We can think of some even more recent examples. Childish Gambino's most recent video has been acclaimed all over for kind of the messages it's sending about being a black man in America, right? So he's standing in for a particular group and communicating a message necessarily about that. But we are faced with this kind of dichotomy between individual and societal level. And these are ongoing tensions, and it's not easy to resolve them all the time. But then there's additional questions here, is what group are they representing? So who do these individual artists represent when they're performing, when they are communicating with their audience members, when they're giving interviews, when they're making music videos? Who are they representing, and do they represent them? How do they represent them? How aware are the artists of that representation? Some artists are a little more political than others in terms of the ideas and the socio-historical context that they are deliberately engaging with. And then that's going to, in turn, affect us as audience members. How does it affect you as a viewer, consciously or unconsciously? Is it reflecting socio-historical trends that you have noted, that you're aware of? And how does it make you feel in relation to that? So are you more or less comfortable with those ideas? Would it help you now to interact with someone from that group? What's the group? How are they being represented? How are the artists representing themselves in relation to that? And how does that affect you? These are kind of hard questions to answer, but they're useful to us in reflecting critically on how popular culture is likely to spread perceptions of culture abroad and at home. Now, as with many kind of critical, reflective, or analytical exercises such as this, we can probably read as much or as little into these examples as we want, right? Do we look at David Lee Roth singing Just a Gigolo as kind of just a silly, flashy music video, or is it a criticism of the music industry and how it's all this formulaic kind of music video production thing, and he's using this complex analogy. Well, it's not that complex, comparing to sex workers and how they're selling themselves for their own necessity and other people's enjoyment, right? So which is it? Does it matter? Is it silly? Is it a critique? Is it both? And what does that do for us? Now, the goal of the exercise and trying to think about these things in terms of the stereotypes is to complicate these ideas a little bit more. Now, stereotypes are not a good thing, so you're not expected to demonstrate their value or badness. Sometimes people respond in their posts, well, I think stereotypes are always bad. It's like, okay, well, we know that. But that's not the goal in this particular exercise, to defend or decry stereotypes. Rather, we want to discuss how a media artifact is or is not supporting those stereotypes. How does it match up with those stereotypes? And that should remind us how complex individuals are and how complex group representation is, and how stereotypes sometimes are based in somewhat truths, but at the end of the day, they are shortcuts. They're cognitive shortcuts that are based on assumptions. And in our line of work, we don't want to make those kinds of assumptions, but it is always useful to compare that space between manifest generalizations and individuals, how they choose to fit in or not with those representations. Now, we can also think about the role stereotypes play in creating more intercultural conflict. So these kinds of expectations that we have regarding stereotypes and what we expect groups to be like and people from those groups to be like, that can feed into our conflicts. Why? Because conflicts are usually based on perceived differences of incompatibility, of values and norms and other things of that variety. And so it's the perceived differences that matters more than actual differences most of the time. It's how do you perceive yourself to be different from other people. Now, stereotypes are not absolute, of course, they're generalizations, but they exist. They're reflecting perceived patterns, not necessarily actual differences, but stereotypes reflect perceived differences across groups, and that can contribute to conflict as well, right? Because we have these expectations of people, and sometimes they are fulfilled, sometimes they're violated. So the task for that discussion post regarding conflict had you consider the theories that are talked about there and use them to analyze some specific examples. So let's think about what these theories have in common for the sake of this present discussion so that we can think about what we can learn from them. So like the textbook's contextual model, these all stress context. They are multidimensional, like the context that Newlip is talking about, right? We have these different layers, like an onion almost, that are all intersecting and all bringing something different to interactions and perceptions. It's multidimensional, and so are these theories, right? They're talking about conflict is never just one thing. It has to do with when and where and how it happens and who it happens between, what groups those people are from, what perceptions they bring to the table, what competence and what other personality traits and skills they bring to the table. And all these things feed into what happens with the conflict. We could see a lot of great examples in the discussion post this week as to how people choose their conflict strategy based on that context. So sometimes you may be more engaging, other times you may be more accommodating. It's going to depend on personal goals and motives as to what strategy makes the most sense. So it isn't necessarily that any one of these kind of contingency model strategies, responses, are absolute. Like this is the only way to go, right? Okay, we always have to engage with that conflict head on. Well, that's not always true, and it's definitely not always true in intercultural context because depending on where you come from, that could cause more harm than you intend because people have different norms and expectations. So on that note, we can actually apply that same critical thought to the contingency model itself. Let's think about some of the limitations of that model. So is it reasonable to expect people to respond in a way that we would value? Coming from our culture, we tend to value a bit more, all right? We want to deal with those problems. We want to engage with them. We want to try and have a dialogue about them and explore why we're feeling the way we're feeling. But those dynamic engaging styles are not always universally appreciated. So again, we don't have to think very hard from our current expertise and things we've learned as to there are other cultures where harmony is far more important and more important than solving any particular given problem, right? So often nothing will be said at all in favor of maintaining the harmony of relationships rather than solving problems, right? So we can't, for better or worse, we can't just expect that every culture is going to behave in the same way and that a lot of these contingency model solutions are going to work for people in every context. So while the model is kind of saying that, well, depending on the situation, there's going to be different responses, but it's also easy for us as Westerners to look at it and be like, all right, well, this is the style that's going to make the most sense in pretty much every situation. But that's not always going to be the case. So thinking about that, it might put a disproportionate burden on those seeking to understand versus those who simply react to conflict. So if you think that engagement style and in understanding the problem is key to improving the relationship, well, you might be alone on that. That doesn't mean you're wrong, but it means that you might have a disproportionate burden in terms of thinking about how to deal with those problems and seeking that understanding because other people's resolution for uncertainty is not going to be the same way. They're not going to follow the same strategy. So it's just something to think about. There's the limitations of these models. Sometimes they could be seen as West-centric, and we want to be aware of how these things, while perfectly reasonable in theory, might encounter challenges in practice. A couple of additional notes on theory in general here. Since we're all experts on these different research paradigms now, there's an opportunity for us to think about, well, what kind of theories are going to be useful to us and what do we want them to look like? Because people argue about this all the time in intercultural communication. So a word I'd like you to think about is parsimony, and this has to do with the least complicated model that fully explains the phenomenon in question. So this has to do usually with things like post-positivist or social scientific approaches. When we're trying to create a model that captures these different variables, we also usually want it to be parsimonious. That means not overly complex. We want it to be a simple explanation because that's going to be more useful to us. So I mention this because some of the discussion posts were like, well, I like this model because it's got all these moving parts and it's more complete. It covers all these different factors and contexts, and so that is valuable to us. But we also want to question how much does it add, right? So if we're looking at this and we're trying to explain something like the factors that lead to conflict in a given interaction, and we can explain, well, we can explain maybe 50% of those factors. Well, that's great. That's really good in terms of the social sciences if we can come up with that profound a model. You might be like, all right, well, I want to add more factors, more variables to this model so that I can completely explain 100% the interactions that people are having and be able to predict things. Well, that's not exactly how it works. And part of the reason is, well, all the reasons we've discussed, the challenges, the limitations of those kinds of generalizations break down at the individual level. There's just so many other contextual factors pushing into it. So it's always a balance when it comes to social science as to what's going to be a parsimonious model. So social scientists typically prefer parsimonious models, but complexity adds richness sometimes. And so it's always a balance between those things. We could think about it from the perspective of other research paradigms, right? The interpretive and critical scholars may very deliberately complicate our assumptions and understanding, reminding us that humans are complex and that context matters. It's not that social scientists don't care about context, quite the contrary. That's something that we're often trying to take into consideration. However, the goal is often also parsimony. We're trying to simplify the model and try and create these more generalizable patterns because it's very difficult to account for all the idiosyncrasies. Whereas the interpretive scholars remember that the goal is to enrich our understanding of human experience. So deliberately complicating those kinds of assumptions and saying, well, this is how some people live and this is how some other people live and experience life, that can be valuable to us as well to enrich our understanding of human experience. Which is right? Well, it depends. Depends on the kind of questions you're asking and what kind of goals you're trying to reach. If you're trying to do something like enact policy, you're going to want a more parsimonious model. You don't want to have a really complicated law that's going to take into account every single contingency because it's impossible to do. You want something that's going to do the most good for the most people in society. It's a different approach, right? If you start promulgating things for every contingency in every group, you end up with an overly complex legal system, and then you have all kinds of conflicts arise and inequalities and things like that. But if your goal is to improve understanding of people in a different position and show, for instance, policymakers what it's like to live in a different part of the world or a different walk of life, then you're going to want to complicate their assumptions. You're going to want to complicate the picture. So it depends on the goals, and that's what those different paradigms are useful for, right? Trying to figure out, well, first of all, what kinds of questions we want to ask is going to help us figure out which approach to use. And I hope that I've given you a sense this semester as to how and why these different approaches are useful in their own ways. Let's move on to some of our other discussion posts. The real-world settings discussion post asks you to focus on the domain of education, specifically higher education, and how that's likely to change in the near future. Of the three domains that NULIP discusses, healthcare, business, and education, I thought this one might be more relevant to you immediately. So let's consider that for a moment. I asked you to think about what higher education is likely to look like in the future. Now, most people seem to agree that this is going to be more digital, more multimodal, sometimes more online, and as a consequence, a bit more multicultural. So as technology enables more people to have access to education, can we expect them to be pursuing education in the United States? Is that likely to be part of this? And so another question we asked was, what's the dominant culture likely to be in higher education? So if more and more people want to get an education in the United States and we have more online classes, that means that they'll necessarily be subject to what the dominant culture is here in education. So questions naturally arise as to what is the dominant culture going to be? So a lot of people on the discussion boards kind of mentioned that, well, they think it's going to be white male dominant in the United States because that's what everything is assumed to be in terms of dominant culture. However, we can complicate that assumption, speaking of complicating assumptions, by looking at some of the demographics a little bit. So in higher education, the numbers don't necessarily reflect a white male dominated population, at least, while the popular opinion may be that we have this image of the stuffy old white men dictating how and when everyone else can get an education, but the numbers are shifting, and that may not necessarily be the case anymore. So what's the dominant culture supposed to look like? Well, it's hard to say. If we're looking at the demographics for clues, well, here's some demographics. So there are more women than men in higher education these days. It's less so in STEM fields, but it's more than 50%, and those are numbers from 2006, and they've been climbing, and that's at the undergraduate level. My classes, by comparison, the class you're in now, is around 18 to 22% male, and that's consistent with other humanities courses. The disparity is more pronounced in advanced degrees, with women attaining doctorates and master's degrees at higher rates than men. And there are other biases as well in hiring, even in the STEM fields, for female professors. I saw a recent study that, well, there's 5 studies actually being summarized in one investigation where they found a 2-to-1 hiring bias for female professors in STEM fields. So their conclusion was it's a great time to be a female in a STEM field because you're more likely to get a job. So we may assume that, as tradition dictates, or traditional assumptions at any rate, that the dominant culture is going to be reflecting white male, but that's changing, and it has been changing, and it may not be the case now. The highest educated group in the United States is black women, in fact. So higher education may not actually match up with those assumptions all that well. What does that mean for us, though? So the exercise asked you to consider how the changing classroom is likely to influence education and what the implications for intercultural communication may be in the future. So what does it mean for us if we want to think about, all right, are these demographics likely to lead to a shift in higher education and how it's approached? What does it mean for the strategies that students and teachers can and should enact? If this is truly going to become more multicultural, what can we do with the lessons that we've learned to help us work through that? So just going off what we were just talking about, if we expect something like gender or sex to play a role in communication styles, and more professors end up being women, are classrooms likely to favor more discussion style strategies or affective communication styles instead of instrumental communication styles? But then it's a second question, even if that's the case, does that matter too much? Would we expect those discussion styles to be more beneficial to all kinds of students? It would seem likely that if affective communication strategies are followed, there's going to be increased immediacy between teachers and students, and that has been demonstrated to improve teaching outcomes. So how is that likely to affect multicultural classrooms? Is it going to be good for all students? Is it going to be good for some students? Is it going to be good for female students and not other students? Is it going to be good for Americans who prefer discussion strategies, but not so much from other cultures where they want kind of a top-down approach? Well, those may not be questions that we are prepared to answer at this time, but it is worth our consideration and our reflection, noting that we're going to have more exchange across cultures. Cultures shift, they change, so do norms and contexts, and we can kind of use our imaginations to figure out, well, what kind of strategies are going to be best to engage across cultures? And on that note, we can think about intercultural competence, which is the most recent discussion board, which will still be open until tomorrow night. So if you haven't done that yet and you want to earn some more points and have not reached the cap yet, feel free to participate on this post after watching this video. So when it comes to intercultural competence, often modern scholars are talking about kind of skill sets and orientations that will help you in intercultural contexts. So thinking about the components of intercultural competence from Newlip's model, or what Newlip's discussing in the textbook anyway, he mentions a couple of things. For one, knowledge. And this kind of ends up being the skills you have. Do you know whether an individual is from an individualist culture or a collectivist culture? Do you know if they're high or low context, small or large power distances, high or low uncertainty avoidance? Are you rigid or ethnocentric in your thinking? Do you have many nonverbal and verbal scripts at your disposal? These are all kind of grouped into the knowledge component of intercultural competence that Newlip mentioned. So if you're in, say, a multicultural classroom, do you have different strategies and scripts and knowledge equipped that you will be better prepared to engage all those different students? We can think about, so scripts in particular has to do with, for everyday interactions, you develop scripts, which are kind of these normal patterns of interaction that your brain kind of records and uses, pulls from memory to use later. So for instance, when I was living in Japan, I would frequently, whenever meeting a new person, follow the same script. I would talk to them, they would be amazed I spoke Japanese, and that conversation would follow a very simple, predictable trajectory of me being what I perceive to be appropriately humble about my Japanese studies, and them being what they perceive to be appropriately impressed by the fact that I was actually speaking their language. And that follows a very predictable script. At first, it was unusual. I was like, oh, really? I didn't realize I was actually good at Japanese. But over time, you develop a script, and it's like, oh, yes, okay. Yeah, I studied for many years, and now I live in a rural area, and it follows the normal pattern. It becomes less uncertain with time and practice. So that's an example of a script that I would follow in that situation. Now you can think of plenty of examples of your day-to-day scripts that you use here in your own culture of interacting with coworkers, interacting with friends, family, teachers. And so part of the knowledge component is that you have to develop those kinds of scripts in terms of interacting with people from a different culture, being appropriately curious or inquisitive or listening without being too overbearing or weird about it, right? That would fall into the knowledge category. Affective would be approach or avoidance tendencies. How do your experiences affect your motivation to interact with other people from different cultures? So are you going to interact with them to begin with? That's what this affective component has to do with. Psychomotor skills, that has to do with translating knowledge into verbal and nonverbal performance and role enactment. So do you speak the language? Can you take all those language scripts, nonverbal and verbal scripts that you know, and enact them in the appropriate context? That would be a psychomotor component. And of course, as with everything else, there's situational factors. How does the actual context affect the situation? Status differences, previous contact, third-party interventions. Is someone mediating this exchange? Is it condoned, like school environment? All these things feed into the situational factors and components of intercultural competence. So it doesn't take much imagination to think about how these components factor into your intercultural competence and how you interact with someone from a different culture. Now, as I've mentioned before, a lot of the times we have conflicts or ethical dilemmas, which will be the subject of that particular discussion post, right? These are the result of misunderstanding or perceived fundamental differences. And you can see how some of those components of intercultural competence can reduce those misunderstandings and perceived fundamental differences. And it's not always just knowledge and what you know, whether or not you speak the language. There's other things that go into this, including personality traits. So in light of that, I think that there's a lot of qualities that will help you to be more interculturally competent. And I want to leave you with those, not just as you reflect on the discussion post, but as you go forward from this class and try to apply these lessons, which I hope you find useful. And these are kind of reflected from my lecture that you've already looked at, but I think it's worth me actually talking about them to you so that they might make a little bit more sense. I mean, they're pretty straightforward, right? Empathy, Can you walk a mile in someone else's shoes? Are you trying to understand how people arrived at the place that they're at? If you ever stop doing that, you're not being interculturally competent. I can say that right out of the gate, and I said that right at the beginning of the class as well, right? Remember the first discussions we had about the events in Charlottesville, and it's tempting to look at that and say, I can never understand these neo-Nazis and these racists and whatever, and why can't they just be less racist? Well, that is a valid argument in the sense that it's not really good to be racist, right? But we understand that. What we understand less is how those people come to have those opinions that you find so abhorrent. And if you don't try to understand how they got there, that doesn't mean you have to like them. That doesn't mean you have to even forgive them or condone them in any way. But you need to try to understand how people get to the place they're at, especially if you disagree with them and don't like them. So empathy is a key skill that we need to practice. And the people who think they're the best at this are often the worst, because it's very easy to fall back on kind of, well, maybe your soapbox or your values or your ethics, and forget that not everyone shares those values. And if we want to reduce conflicts, we need to be aware of them. So in that sense, we also want to temper our empathy and our emotions and our concern with pragmatism. We need to recognize when we can influence certain things. You may not be in a position to change the cultural differences that you find most abhorrent and that you think are truly damaging. So say you try to empathize with the culture, but you can understand why they do things a way, but you still can't condone the practice. Something like female circumcision, right? That's really hard for you to empathize with to begin with, but you can be like, all right, it's a cultural practice. I can see why they do that, but they really shouldn't be doing that. So how do we change that? Well, you may not be able to change that, but you might be in some situations where you can pragmatically explain your position on it and how you feel about it and how it's viewed in your culture. You may not be able to change an entire culture, but at any rate, you need to be able to temper your emotions with pragmatism and recognize what battles can be won, what battles can be fought, and which ones should be picked. Of course, recognizing context is a huge theme throughout this course, and I hope that we've practiced that skill a lot, recognizing context and thinking about how and why people end up where they're at and how and why you end up where you're at. And trying to think of not just socio-historic assumptions and stereotypes as to how this person from this culture is going to behave in this situation, but recognizing the multimodality, the complicated nature of context. It's not just a room that you step into. It is a combination of variables and factors. Now, at the end of the day, I think what's going to help you most when you're in any sort of intercultural situation is listening skills. Being open to other opinions. And again, that doesn't mean you have to like or condone them, but you do need to listen to them and try and figure out how people end up where they're at. The path to empathy is listening. If you cannot listen to others, then we're just not going to get anywhere. So these skills get better with practice. And they sound pretty simple because, well, you know these things intuitively. But hopefully now, at this point in the semester, after taking this course, you have enough of those knowledge points, those skills and backgrounds, that you can start to tie all these things together and think about how these kinds of simple, fairly straightforward skills can benefit you in intercultural communication. So it's one thing to know that these skills are useful to you, but now hopefully you have a sense as to how to actually make use of them. So that's it for today's video, and that's it for the whole semester, in fact. So if you have any questions about anything, I am always available by email, and I hope that you found the course enjoyable and helpful, and I wish you all the best of luck in your academic careers and futures. Thanks as always. I'll talk to you again soon.